When we talk about clean energy, our minds usually jump straight to solar panels, maybe wind turbines. But what about the single biggest source of renewable power on the entire planet? Today, let's dive into the world of hydroelectric energy. It's powerful, it's controversial, and it's often completely overlooked. So, let's start with a number, 17%. That's how much of the world's electricity comes from hydropower. This isn't some small-time player, folks. It is a massive, fundamental part of our global energy system.
And to really put that into perspective, that 17% is more than solar, wind, geothermal, and all the other renewables put together. Seriously. For decades, hydropower wasn't just part of the clean energy conversation, it was the conversation.
Which brings us to the main idea here. Hydropower is kind of like the forgotten giant. It's been around for so long that we sometimes forget just how powerful it is, but also how big of a shadow it can cast. So let's get into it. How does this whole thing even work?
Before we can really get into the pros and cons, we gotta understand the basics. I mean, how do you turn a simple river into the electricity that's powering your screen right now? Well, it all comes down to a really simple idea.
At its heart, hydroelectric energy is just about capturing the raw power of moving water. For centuries, people used water wheels to do things like grind grain. You can think of a modern hydro plant as that same basic idea, just scaled up to a size that can power an entire city.
And the process itself is surprisingly straightforward. In a big dam, water gets held back in a massive reservoir, building up a ton of potential energy. When it's released, it rushes down with incredible force, and that force spins the blades of a giant turbine. That turbine is hooked up to a generator, and as it spins, it converts that raw motion into electricity. Simple, elegant, and just unbelievably powerful.
Okay, so we've got the basics down. Now, let's build the case for this giant. Why has it been the king of renewables for so long? Well, the advantages are pretty compelling, and they go way beyond just being clean.
First off, yeah, it's clean and renewable. It's literally powered by the rain and snow that make up the water cycle. But its real superpower? Reliability. See, unlike solar or wind that depend on the weather, a dam can store water and generate power whenever we need it, 24/7. You can crank it up or dial it back in minutes, which makes it perfect for keeping our modern power grid stable. Plus, it's super efficient and drives huge economic investment.
And that brings us to efficiency. We can measure this with something called a capacity factor, which is basically just a fancy way of saying how much power a plant actually produces versus its maximum potential. And at 47%, hydropower is, by a long shot, the most efficient and established type of renewable energy we have. It consistently just works. But here's the really crucial part. Its tiny carbon footprint. Over its entire life, from building the thing to running it, hydropower only puts out about 24 grams of CO2 equivalent for every kilowatt hour. Now, compare that to natural gas, which sits at a whopping 490. The difference is just staggering. And that potential is why we're still seeing huge investments today. Places like China, Brazil, and Turkey are going all in. I mean, in 2020 alone, China was responsible for almost 60% of all new hydropower projects in the world. This giant of the energy world is definitely still growing. So let's recap. It's clean, it's reliable, it's efficient, and it's powerful. It sounds almost perfect, right? Too good to be true? And that, of course, brings us to the big question. What's the catch? Because when you're dealing with something powerful enough to literally move mountains and reshape the land, there's always a catch.
And this is where the story gets complicated. This is the great paradox of hydropower. All the good stuff is measured in clean megawatts and lower emissions. But the costs are measured in flooded valleys, in shattered ecosystems, and sometimes even in sparking international conflicts.
Look, building a dam is a brute force act of engineering. You are fundamentally changing a river's entire existence. It means flooding enormous areas of land, completely wiping out habitats. And that giant concrete wall, it becomes an impassable barrier for migrating fish, which can absolutely devastate entire species and, in turn, the communities that rely on them.
And here's the real irony. While hydropower is a weapon against climate change, it's also incredibly vulnerable to it. These historic droughts we're seeing, made worse by a warming planet, have dropped water levels at huge reservoirs like Lake Powell in the US to crisis levels. We're talking about threatening the power and water for tens of millions of people. The one thing it needs, water, is becoming its biggest weakness.
And when a river flows across national borders, dams suddenly become tools of geopolitical power. Just look at the Nile, where Ethiopia's massive new dam has sparked this huge dispute with Egypt and Sudan over who controls the water. Or on the Mekong River, where Chinese dams upstream are being blamed for causing terrible droughts downstream in countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. Water is power in every single sense of the word.
So we're left with this paradox, right? On one hand, you've got immense clean power. On the other, immense disruption. So what do we do? In a world that is staring down a climate emergency, can we really afford to ignore this giant? Or can we learn to use its power a bit more wisely this time around?
And let's be really clear about the stakes here. The latest IPCC report basically declared a code red for humanity. We have to cut global emissions in half by 2030. That is an enormous challenge. And frankly, we need every tool we can get. And hydropower, with all its problems, is one of the most powerful tools we have.
And believe it or not, there's still incredible potential. Globally, experts estimate that about half of all the economically viable hydropower potential in the world remains completely untapped. That is a staggering amount of clean, reliable energy just sitting there, waiting. And this brings us right back to where we started. The head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, said it perfectly. He calls hydropower that forgotten giant that we have to put back on the agenda. The world's top energy experts are telling us we simply can't hit our climate targets without it. So here's the bottom line. We know the incredible benefits, and we know the devastating costs. The real challenge for the next decade isn't if we should use hydropower, but how. With smarter technology, with a better understanding of ecosystems, can we finally figure out how to unleash this giant's power without getting crushed by its weight? That's the real question we need to answer.